The lion attacked every human it saw, until the shocking reason behind its fury was revealed. The Everglades Wildlife Sanctuary sprawled across 30 acres of carefully maintained Florida landscape, home to rescued exotic animals that couldn't survive in the wild. For 15 years, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had served as head veterinarian, but nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for what began on that humid September morning. "Doc, you need to come to Atlas's enclosure right now." James Cooper's voice crackled through her radio, tension evident in every word. In his 20 years as senior animal keeper, James had never sounded this worried. Sarah grabbed her medical kit and hurried across the sanctuary. Atlas, their 12-year-old male lion, had been with them for a decade, rescued from a defunct circus. He was known among the staff for his gentle demeanor, unusual for a male lion, and especially one with his troubled past. As she approached the enclosure, she saw James standing with Dr. Mark Thompson, their wildlife behavior specialist. Both men's faces were etched with concern. "What happened?" Sarah asked, noting the unusual quiet around the normally active enclosure. "He attacked Randy during the morning feeding," James explained, running a hand through his gray hair. If the safety barrier hadn't been in place, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Randy Phillips was their most experienced big cat keeper. He'd worked with Atlas for 8 years without incident. "How bad?" Sarah asked, already pulling out her phone. "Randy's okay, shaken up, but not hurt. The barrier did its job," Mark answered. "But Sarah, this isn't the first incident this week. Atlas charged at 2 maintenance workers yesterday, and he's been pacing aggressively whenever anyone approaches." Sarah moved closer to the observation window. Atlas was in his outdoor enclosure, pacing back and forth, his massive body tense. His behavior was nothing like the calm, dignified lion she knew. "When did this start exactly?" she asked, taking notes on her tablet. "The aggressive behavior began about 5 days ago," James said. "At first, we thought he was just having an off day. Lions can be moody, you know that, but it's escalating. This morning was different. He wasn't just displaying aggression, he was actively trying to attack." Sarah watched as Atlas suddenly stopped pacing and turned toward them. His eyes locked onto the observation window, and he let out a roar that made the glass vibrate. There was something in his expression that Sarah had never seen before, not just aggression, but what almost looked like distress. "Mark, what's your professional opinion?" Sarah asked the behaviorist. "Initially, I suspected territorial behavior or maybe a response to environmental changes. But this is different," Mark replied, adjusting his glasses. "He's showing signs of distress along with the aggression. Look at his tail position, the excessive salivation. Something's wrong, Sarah. Really wrong." Sarah began listing possibilities in her mind. "When was his last full medical examination?" 3 months ago," James answered promptly. "Everything was normal. Blood work, dental exam, the works. Has there been any change in his diet, his routine, any new medications?" Both men shook their heads. "What about his enclosure? Any changes there?" "Nothing," James said. "Same space, same enrichment items, same schedule. We even checked the water supply and air quality after the first incident." Sarah watched as Atlas resumed his pacing, his movements almost frantic now. Something about his gait caught her attention. "James, does his right side look slightly different to you? The way he's moving?" James stepped closer to the window, squinting. "Now that you mention it, there's something off about his stride." "We need to do a full examination," Sarah decided. "But with his current state, sedation is going to be tricky. We'll need extra hands on deck, and we'll have to be extremely careful with the dosage." "I'll call Dr. Peters from Miami Zoo," Mark offered. "He's got experience with aggressive big cats. Maybe he's seen something like this before." Sarah nodded, still watching Atlas. In all her years working with big cats, she'd never seen such a dramatic personality change without an obvious cause. Whatever was wrong with Atlas, they needed to figure it out fast, before someone got hurt or worse, before administration decided he was too dangerous to keep. Let's clear the area of all non-essential personnel, she instructed. James, I want you to pull all of Atlas's records, medical history, behavior logs, everything from the past 6 months. Mark, after you call Dr. Peters, start reviewing our security footage. I want to see exactly when this behavior started and if we missed any warning signs. As her colleagues moved to follow her instructions, Sarah stayed at the window, studying Atlas. The lion had been through so much in his life: abuse in the circus, a difficult rescue, and a long rehabilitation process. He'd overcome it all to become one of their gentlest residents. There had to be a reason for this sudden change. We'll figure this out, big guy, she whispered, pressing her hand against the glass. Whatever's hurting you, we'll find it. Atlas stopped pacing again, turning to look directly at her. For a brief moment, Sarah saw something in his eyes, not anger, but pain. Then he roared again, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the sanctuary. By late afternoon, Sarah's office had transformed into an impromptu command center. Medical records covered her desk, behavior logs filled her computer screen, and security footage played on a mounted TV. Dr. David Peters from Miami Zoo had arrived, bringing his expertise and additional medical equipment. I've reviewed all the footage from the past 2 weeks, Mark announced, rewinding a particular clip. Look at this, 3 days before the aggressive behavior started. The group gathered around the screen. The nighttime footage showed Atlas in his indoor enclosure, suddenly jerking awake and shaking his head vigorously. He does it again here, Mark continued, forwarding to another clip. And here, always at night, always the same head-shaking motion. Dr. Peters leaned closer to the screen. That's not normal lion behavior, especially during rest periods. Sarah, when was his last neurological exam? 3 months ago, everything was clear, she replied, flipping through the medical records. No signs of any neurological issues. James entered the office carrying more files. I think I found something else. Atlas's food consumption has dropped by about 20% over the last 2 weeks. It's subtle enough that it didn't trigger any immediate concerns, but looking at the pattern now, Sarah frowned. Loss of appetite, aggressive behavior, apparent discomfort. We need to get a closer look at him, but in his current state, that's going to be challenging. I brought our new long-distance injection system, Dr. Peters offered. It's more precise than traditional dart guns, less traumatic for the animal. We could sedate him from a safe distance. The team spent the next hour preparing for the examination. They needed everything ready before attempting sedation, blood testing equipment, imaging devices, and emergency supplies. One mistake with a lion this size could be fatal for either the animal or the humans involved. As they worked, Sarah noticed something in Atlas's old circus records. Look at this, she called to the others. There's a mention of an old injury from his circus days. A metal rod was used to control him, and he took a hard hit to his right side. That was years ago, James said, but his voice was thoughtful. Although, that's the same side he seems to be favoring now. Dr. Peters nodded slowly. Old injuries can cause problems years later, especially in big cats. Their size puts enormous stress on their bodies. The plan came together quickly. They would sedate Atlas early the next morning when he would likely be calmer after his night rest. Dr. Peters would handle the sedation, while Sarah led the medical examination. Mark and James would coordinate the support team. As the others left to prepare, Sarah stayed behind, reviewing the security footage again. Something about Atlas's behavior nagged at her. The aggression seemed almost targeted. He wasn't just lashing out randomly. He appeared to be reacting to something specific. The next morning arrived with a heavy mist hanging over the sanctuary. Atlas was in his indoor enclosure, having just finished picking at his breakfast. The team assembled quietly, each person knowing their role. Remember, Sarah advised through their radio system, if anything goes wrong, everyone evacuates immediately. No heroics. Dr. Peters positioned himself at the designated spot, the new injection system ready. Through the observation window, they could see Atlas pacing, occasionally stopping to shake his head in that now familiar motion. "Whenever you're ready, David," Sarah said quietly. The injection system made barely a sound. Atlas flinched slightly but didn't react aggressively. Within minutes, his movements became slower, more unsteady. "Good sedation," Dr. Peters commented, monitoring Atlas's responses. "He's going down smoothly." Once Atlas was fully sedated, the team moved in quickly. They had maybe an hour to complete their examination before the sedation would begin to wear off. Sarah started with a physical examination, paying special attention to his right side. As her hands moved over his ribs, she felt something that made her pause. "There's definitely some swelling here," she announced. "James, help me position the portable X-ray." The images appeared on their tablet screen, and suddenly everything made sense. There, in Atlas's right side, was a clear abnormality, a mass pressing against his ribs, in exactly the spot where he'd been injured years ago. "It looks like dense tissue," Dr. Peters observed, studying the images. "Possibly a tumor, though we'll need a biopsy to be sure. And look, it's pressing against his thoracic nerve cluster. That would explain the head shaking and the aggression." "He's been in pain," Sarah said softly, running her hand gently over Atlas's mane. "Severe pain, and we missed it. The aggression wasn't random. He was reacting to people getting close to his injured side." Further examination revealed more evidence. The mass had grown significantly in recent weeks, explaining the sudden onset of symptoms. Atlas's blood work showed elevated white cell counts, suggesting his body was fighting something. "We need to get him into surgery," Sarah decided. "The sooner we remove this mass, the better his chances." "Surgery on a lion isn't exactly routine," Dr. Peters cautioned. "The risks are less than leaving him like this," Sarah finished. "He's suffering, and it's only going to get worse. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "that's why I called in the best exotic animal surgeon in Florida." Dr. Peters couldn't help but return her smile. "Well, when you put it that way, we'll need to set up a proper surgical suite, bring in specialized equipment." "I'll call the board," James offered. "They'll need to approve the emergency funding." As the sedation began wearing off, they moved quickly to secure Atlas in his enclosure. Sarah stayed until the last possible moment, her hand resting on his massive paw. "We're going to fix this big guy," she promised. "Just hang in there a little longer." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation. The sanctuary's medical building transformed into an improvised surgical suite, with equipment borrowed from 3 different veterinary hospitals. Sarah hadn't slept more than a few hours, reviewing surgical protocols and coordinating with specialists. "The board approved the emergency funding," James announced, entering the prep room where Sarah and Dr. Peters were studying Atlas's latest X-rays. "They want us to document everything for their research database." "They'll get their documentation," Sarah replied, not looking up from the images. "But right now, our priority is Atlas." The morning of the surgery arrived with an unexpected complication. As the team prepared to sedate Atlas again, dark clouds rolled in from the Gulf, bringing the threat of one of Florida's notorious thunderstorms. "We can't postpone," Dr. Peters said, watching the weather radar on his phone. "That mass is pressing against his nerves more each day. If we wait, the damage could become permanent." Sarah nodded, thinking of Atlas's increasing distress over the past 2 days. "We'll need to reinforce the backup generators. James, can you—" "Already on it," he responded, heading out to coordinate with the maintenance team. The sedation process went smoother this time, perhaps because Atlas's pain had left him exhausted. Once he was unconscious, it took 6 people to carefully transport him to the surgical suite. On the operating table, he looked less like the fierce predator of recent weeks and more like the gentle giant they'd known for years. Dr. Peters took the lead surgeon position with Sarah assisting. As they began the procedure, thunder rumbled in the distance. "Cutting through the first layer," Dr. Peters announced. "Suction, please." The surgery progressed methodically. The mass was more extensive than the X-rays had shown, with tendrils wrapping around Atlas's ribs like ivy on a fence. "It's encapsulated," Sarah observed, carefully helping to expose the growth. That's good news. Means it probably hasn't spread. Just then, a massive thunderclap shook the building. The lights flickered but held steady, thanks to James's preparation with the generators. Blood pressure's holding stable, reported the monitoring technician. Heart rate normal. Hour after hour, they worked to carefully separate the mass from Atlas's healthy tissue. Every move had to be precise. One slip could damage vital nerves or blood vessels. The storm raged outside, but inside the surgical suite, focus and determination ruled. There's the source, Dr. Peters said finally, exposing where the mass originated. Right where that old injury was. The scar tissue probably provided the foundation for this growth. As they worked to remove the last portions of the mass, Sarah couldn't help but think about how long Atlas must have been in pain before it became unbearable enough to change his behavior. Lions were masters at hiding weakness. It was part of their survival instinct. Final piece coming out now, Dr. Peters announced. Specimen basin, please. The mass, once removed, was the size of a grapefruit. They would send it to the lab for analysis, but Dr. Peters was optimistic about its appearance. Looks benign, he said as they began closing. Probably a type of fibroma triggered by that old trauma. The good news is, once removed, these rarely recur. The closure took another hour, requiring multiple layers of sutures to rebuild the damaged tissue. Just as they were finishing, the storm outside began to subside, as if nature itself was acknowledging the completion of their task. Now comes the hard part, Sarah said as they bandaged the incision site. Recovery. For a lion Atlas's size, recovery would be complicated. They'd need to manage his pain, prevent infection, and keep him calm enough to heal, all while keeping the staff safe. James had prepared a special recovery area in Atlas's indoor enclosure, with cameras monitoring every angle and a system for administering medication without direct contact. As they carefully transported Atlas back, Sarah noticed the first hints of sunrise through the windows. 6 hours, she said, checking her watch. Felt like 60. You should get some rest, Dr. Peters advised, removing his surgical cap. I'll stay to monitor his initial recovery. But Sarah shook her head. I need to be here when he wakes up. He'll be disoriented, probably afraid. A familiar presence might help. They settled Atlas into his recovery space, connecting monitoring equipment and ensuring his airways remained clear as the anesthesia wore off. Sarah pulled up a chair just outside the enclosure, close enough to observe but safely behind the protective barriers. You know, James said, bringing her a cup of coffee, in all my years working with big cats, I've never seen anything quite like this. Not just the medical case, but the way everyone came together to help him. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. Atlas has that effect on people. Even when he was scaring everyone half to death this past week, they still cared about him. Through the observation window, they could see Atlas's chest rising and falling steadily. The massive lion, who had been so frightening just days before, now looked peaceful for the first time in weeks. The lab results should be back in a few days, Dr. Peters said, joining them with his own coffee. But I'm confident we got it all. The real challenge now will be keeping him quiet enough to heal properly. Sarah smiled slightly. Well, if anyone can handle a cranky, recovering lion, it's this team. As if in response, Atlas's tail twitched slightly, the first sign that he was beginning to wake up. Atlas's return to consciousness was gradual. First came the tail twitches, then subtle movements of his massive paws, and finally, his eyes began to flutter open. Sarah watched intently from her observation position, looking for any signs of distress. Easy there, big guy, she murmured, even though she knew he couldn't hear her through the protective barrier. Take your time. The first few hours post-surgery were critical. Atlas was confused and agitated as the anesthesia wore off, attempting to stand before his body was ready. Each time he tried, Sarah's heart jumped to her throat, worried he would tear his sutures. Blood pressures elevated, reported Lisa, their veterinary technician. Should we increase the pain medication? Sarah checked the monitors carefully. Not yet. Let's give him a chance to orient himself first. Too much medication might make him more unstable. By late afternoon, Atlas had finally settled into a more restful state, though his eyes remained fixed on the medical team whenever they approached his enclosure. The aggression from before seemed diminished, replaced by what Sarah recognized as confusion and discomfort. "Look at his expression," Mark observed, joining Sarah at the window. "It's different from last week. The pain-induced aggression is gone." Sarah nodded. "But we're not out of the woods yet. Lions are notorious for hiding their discomfort until it becomes unbearable. We need to stay ahead of his pain." The next few days established a careful routine. Every 4 hours, they administered pain medication and antibiotics through a special port in the enclosure wall, designed to minimize direct contact. James and his team developed creative ways to encourage Atlas to move just enough to prevent complications, but not so much as to risk his healing incision. "We've modified his feeding station," James explained, showing Sarah the new setup. "He has to take 2 steps to reach his food, but the angle prevents him from stretching his surgical site." 5 days after the surgery, the lab results arrived, confirming Dr. Peters's initial assessment. The mass was indeed benign, a complex fibroma that had developed around his old injury site. The report indicated clean margins, meaning they had successfully removed all of the affected tissue. "This is the best news we could have hoped for," Dr. Peters said during their morning briefing. "No sign of malignancy, no indication of spread. Once he heals, he should be pain-free for the first time in probably months." But recovery brought its own challenges. Atlas, like any wild animal, didn't understand the need to rest. As he began feeling better, he became more restless, testing the limits of his strengthening body. "He's torn through 2 of his enrichment toys already," James reported on day 7. "We need to find better ways to keep him mentally stimulated without risking physical injury." Sarah had an idea. "What about the visual enrichment system we used during his rehabilitation 10 years ago? The moving images on the enclosure wall?" They set up a projection system that displayed nature scenes: zebras grazing, birds in flight, flowing water. Atlas watched these for hours, his tail twitching occasionally, providing the mental stimulation he needed while his body healed. 2 weeks after surgery, they faced their next big challenge: examining the incision site up close. Despite Atlas's improved demeanor, they couldn't risk approaching without sedation. "Lighter sedation this time," Sarah instructed as they prepared. "Just enough to keep everyone safe." The examination revealed better healing than they'd dared hope for. The incision was clean, with no sign of infection or complications. Atlas's blood work showed normal inflammatory markers, and his appetite had returned to normal. "I think we can start reducing his pain medication," Sarah decided. "Gradually over the next few days. We'll watch for any changes in his behavior." As they decreased the medication, everyone tensely watched for signs of the previous aggression returning. But Atlas remained calm, his eyes clear and focused, so different from the pain-clouded gaze they'd seen weeks before. One morning, about 3 weeks post-surgery, Sarah arrived to find James grinning at the observation window. "Watch this," he said quietly. Atlas was in his outdoor enclosure for the first time since his surgery, moving with careful dignity through his territory. He approached the window and, to Sarah's amazement, did something they hadn't seen in months. He rolled onto his back in a patch of sunlight, exposing his belly in a display of complete relaxation. "Would you look at that?" Sarah breathed, fighting back tears. "That's our old Atlas back." The staff who had been scared to go near his enclosure weeks ago now gathered to watch him, speaking in hushed, happy tones. Atlas's recovery had become more than just a medical success. It had restored faith in the connection between humans and animals. "You know what this means," Mark said, reviewing his behavior charts. "We can start planning his return to regular interaction with the keepers." Sarah nodded but cautioned, "We'll take it slow, one keeper at a time, starting with James. We need to rebuild trust on both sides." That afternoon, They watched as James entered the safety corridor of Atlas's enclosure for the first time since the incidents began. Atlas approached the barrier, but there was no aggression in his movement. Instead, he pressed his massive head against the mesh, rumbling a low greeting that they had all missed hearing. "Hey, old friend," James said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome back." Sarah watched the interaction, making notes but mostly just absorbing the moment. They had not only saved Atlas's life, but had also solved the mystery that had turned their gentle giant into a seemingly aggressive beast. It was a reminder that behavior always had a reason, and sometimes the most frightening actions came from a place of pain rather than malice. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary as Sarah reviewed Atlas's latest progress report. For weeks had passed since the surgery, and each day brought new signs of improvement. Today marked an important milestone: Atlas's first scheduled public viewing since his recovery began. "The school group is here," Randy announced, poking his head into Sarah's office. It was fitting that Randy, who had faced Atlas's aggression firsthand, would be helping with this reintroduction. "How many students?" Sarah asked, gathering her notes. 25 fifth graders and 3 teachers. They've been briefed on the protocols. Sarah had carefully chosen this particular group for Atlas's first public interaction. The students had been studying animal behavior and conservation all semester, and their teacher was a former sanctuary volunteer who understood the delicacy of the situation. As they approached the viewing area, Sarah could see Atlas in his outdoor enclosure, looking regal and composed, a far cry from the distressed animal of weeks ago. The students gathered quietly behind the safety barrier, their excited whispers barely audible. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah began, addressing the group. "Today you're going to meet someone very special. Atlas has quite a story to tell, and you're the first visitors he's meeting since his recovery." The children listened intently as Sarah explained Atlas's journey, from circus performer to sanctuary resident, through his recent medical crisis and recovery. She carefully emphasized the importance of understanding animal behavior rather than jumping to conclusions. When Atlas wasn't feeling well, some people thought he had become dangerous, she explained. But what did he really need? "Help," a little girl in the front row answered. "He was hurting and couldn't tell anyone." Sarah smiled. "Exactly. Sometimes when animals or people act differently, it's because they're in pain or scared. The key is to look deeper and try to understand why." As if on cue, Atlas approached the viewing area. The students gasped collectively, but remained still as instructed. The lion moved with fluid grace, showing no sign of his recent surgery except for a slight patch of shorter fur on his right side. "Watch his body language," Sarah guided them. "See how his ears are forward, how his tail is relaxed. These are signs that he's comfortable and curious." Atlas sat near the window, surveying the young audience with what Sarah had come to recognize as his teaching expression: calm, dignified, almost wise. One boy raised his hand tentatively. "Yes," Sarah acknowledged. "Does he remember being sick? Does he know you helped him?" It was a profound question for such a young mind. "Animals live very much in the present," Sarah explained, "but they do form associations. Atlas associates our team with relief from pain now, rather than with the discomfort he felt before. That's why he's comfortable with us again." The educational session continued for 30 minutes, with Atlas remaining engaged throughout. He even demonstrated some of his enrichment activities, showing how he had learned to use puzzle feeders that helped with his physical therapy. After the students left, Sarah stayed behind, watching Atlas return to his favorite resting spot under a large oak tree. James joined her, carrying Atlas's afternoon medications, now reduced to just preventative antibiotics. "That went well," he commented. "Better than we could have hoped." Sarah nodded. "It's not just about Atlas anymore. His story is teaching people about patience, understanding, and looking beyond surface behaviors." The sanctuary had already begun implementing changes based on Atlas's case. They developed new protocols for behavioral changes in their residents, emphasizing medical investigation before making any decisions about an animal's future. Sarah's detailed documentation of Atlas's case would be published in veterinary journals, helping other facilities recognize similar symptoms. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat in her office, updating Atlas's files. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Peters, who had been keeping tabs on his patient's progress. Saw the video from today's presentation. Hard to believe this is the same lion from 6 weeks ago. Sometimes the biggest victories come from our most challenging cases. Proud to have been part of his team. Sarah smiled, remembering the tense days of surgery and early recovery. They had all learned valuable lessons. About medicine, about behavior, about not giving up on an animal even when the situation seemed hopeless. A familiar roar echoed across the sanctuary, Atlas's evening greeting, now restored to its normal, confident tone rather than the pain-filled sound they'd heard during his illness. Sarah walked to her office window, which overlooked his enclosure. Atlas was performing his sunset ritual, patrolling his territory before settling in for the night. He paused, looking toward her window, and Sarah could have sworn he nodded slightly before continuing his rounds. "Good night, teacher," she whispered, because that's what Atlas had become, not just a patient who needed healing, but a teacher who had shown them all the importance of looking deeper, of not giving up, of finding the real story behind changed behavior. The sanctuary was quieting down for the night, but Sarah knew this wasn't really an ending. It was a new beginning for Atlas, for the sanctuary, and for all the animals and people whose lives would be touched by the lessons learned from one lion's journey back to health. 6 months after Atlas's surgery, the sanctuary had transformed in subtle but significant ways. Sarah stood in the newly established Behavioral Health Center, a dedicated space created in response to Atlas's case. The walls displayed monitoring screens showing real-time footage of various animal residents, while medical and behavioral records were now digitally integrated for more comprehensive care. "The board wants to know if you're ready to present at next month's International Wildlife Conservation Conference," Mark said, entering with a stack of papers. "They're calling Atlas's case a breakthrough in behavioral health care for big cats." Sarah nodded, reviewing the preliminary data on her tablet. Since implementing their new protocols, they'd identified early medical issues in 3 other sanctuary residents, preventing them from escalating into behavioral crises. "I'll present," she agreed, "but I want Atlas's story to be more than just a medical case study. It's about changing how we approach behavioral changes in captive wildlife." The sanctuary had become a model for other facilities. Weekly video consultations connected their team with zoos and sanctuaries across the country, sharing their enhanced monitoring systems and intervention protocols. Atlas's case had sparked a movement in the wildlife care community. That afternoon, Sarah led a training session for new staff members, using Atlas's outdoor enclosure as their classroom. The lion himself lay regally on his favorite platform, seemingly aware of his role in their education. "Before Atlas," Sarah explained to the attentive group, "we had separate systems for tracking medical and behavioral issues. Now, we understand they're often interconnected. Watch his behavior now compared to these recordings from during his illness." The contrast in the footage was striking. The agitated, aggressive lion from 6 months ago bore little resemblance to the calm, engaging creature before them. One of the new keepers raised her hand. "How do you distinguish between normal behavioral changes and potential medical issues?" "Excellent question," Sarah replied. "We've developed what we call the Atlas Protocol, a comprehensive checklist that helps us evaluate subtle changes. Everything from eating patterns to sleeping positions gets logged and analyzed." James arrived with Atlas's afternoon enrichment items, puzzle feeders designed to encourage natural behaviors while preventing overexertion. They watched as Atlas engaged with the challenges, his movements showing no sign of his previous injury. "Each resident now has a personalized baseline profile," James added, demonstrating their new tracking system. "Any deviation triggers an automatic alert for review. We're catching potential issues weeks earlier than we used to." The sanctuary's success had attracted attention beyond the wildlife care community. Local schools now included regular visits in their science curriculum, using Atlas's story to teach children about empathy and the importance of looking beyond surface behaviors. Remember, Sarah continued with the training group, every behavior tells a story. Our job is to learn how to read those stories correctly. Later that day, Sarah received an unexpected visit from Randy, who had transferred to the sanctuary's education department after Atlas's recovery. "You need to see this," he said enthusiastically, pulling up a video on his phone. It showed a group of middle school students applying the Atlas protocol to understand challenging behaviors in their school community. They had adapted the sanctuary's observation techniques to help identify when their classmates might be struggling with hidden problems. "They're calling it the Atlas effect," Randy explained, using his story to teach empathy and problem-solving. Who would have thought a lion could help with school counseling? Sarah smiled, remembering the frightening days when Atlas's future had seemed so uncertain. "He's always been a teacher," she said. "We just had to learn how to understand his lessons." The sanctuary's daily rounds now included detailed behavioral observations of all residents. Sarah stopped at each enclosure, noting the subtle interplay between physical and emotional well-being. The staff had developed a deeper understanding of their charges, recognizing that behavioral changes were often the first signal of underlying issues. As the day drew to a close, Sarah made her final stop at Atlas's enclosure. He was engaged in his evening ritual, but paused to acknowledge her presence with a gentle chuff, a far cry from the fearful aggression of 6 months ago. "You've changed all of us," she said softly, watching him settle into his night shelter. "Not just with your recovery, but with what you taught us along the way." The sanctuary's lights dimmed, but the monitoring systems continued their vigilant watch, a testament to the lessons learned from one lion's journey. In her office, Sarah finalized her presentation for the upcoming conference, titled "The Atlas Effect: Revolutionizing Behavioral Healthcare in Wildlife Sanctuaries." Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Peters. "Just reviewed your conference abstract. Atlas's legacy will help countless animals. Sometimes our greatest teachers have 4 legs and a roar."